Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and I will again be speaking to Jacob Rees-Mogg. And Jacob, inevitably at the start, we turn to what this weekend, for me, is truly your first moment, if only in caricature, of national fame, because you starred, if you're not previously aware of it, on Tracey Ullman Breaks the News. Has this been drawn to your attention?
It has indeed, and I hear that Nanny stars as well, which I think is even more important, that she should get her moment in lights.
Have you seen it?
I have, yes. I thought it was very funny, actually.
I have to ask this. This is where my questions on the subject have been leading. I want to know if Nanny saw it.
No, I must show it to Nanny. I watched it on the iPlayer, and I must show it to Nanny probably tomorrow evening.
Did you laugh?
Yes, I thought it was very funny, and there was a certain part of it that was a bit too close to the bone, I think.
For the benefit of the listeners who may not have seen it, there's a point in it where you tell someone who's come to arrive to be interviewed for a job that one of the problems with socialism is everything gets handed to you on a plate, and you're duly handed by Nanny a piece of cake on a plate.
Indeed. That is absolutely true, yes, yes.
Well, I think we've exhausted that subject, but we're going to stay in Somerset for a moment, because I wanted to ask you if your constituency, I'm sorry my geography is so poor, is anywhere near Porlock?
Not particularly, no. I'm the north of Somerset and Porlock's more in the south.
The reason I asked is Porlock is the spot where Anthony Newton tried to shoot Norman Scott, as dramatised in this book by John Preston, a very English scandal about the Thorpe affair.
And to think I thought it was wrong Kubla Khan, because isn't it a gentleman from Porlock who interrupts?
It's the postman from Porlock, yes. Interrupts late. Just when Coleridge has written, from memory, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and I forget the next line. It ends, and drunk the milk of paradise. That's where the poem ends. It wouldn't have ended there if the postman hadn't knocked. But I just wondered if did your family know Thorpe? I mean, Thorpe was in the next county, but it was the Somerset police who investigated the attempted murder.
We did indeed. My father had known Jeremy Thorpe up at Oxford. My father was president of the union and Jeremy Thorpe had been president, I think, just before him. And Rupert Thorpe, Jeremy's son, is an exact contemporary of mine, and we used to go to children's tea parties together when I was probably 3 or 4. So I knew who Jeremy Thorpe was. I knew that I knew his son, and my parents certainly knew both Jeremy Thorpe and both his wives.
You've no memory of Thorpe yourself?
No, I don't remember meeting him. I do remember vague childhood memories of going to tea parties.
The family presumably knew Auberon Waugh, who in one sense, I suppose, was Thorpe's nemesis, in that he went after him in private eye and became one of the means by which Thorpe's misdemeanours became drawn to public attention.
Well, the Waughs and the Rees-Moggs have been connected for a very long time, because Dr. Waugh was the doctor in Midsummer Norton, a town in my constituency, and William Rees-Mogg was the local solicitor, and Dr. Waugh was the doctor to William Rees-Mogg, and William Rees-Mogg was the solicitor to Dr. Waugh. So we've sort of known the Waughs for generations, and my father and Auberon Waugh were very friendly acquaintances, I think would be a good way of putting it, and very much liked the fact that they had a strong Somerset connection. And Auberon Waugh wrote for the Times whilst my father was editor, and my father always liked him and admired his writing.
Did you know him? You're not too young to have known.
I met him a few times. I invited him to speak for me, actually, when I was up at Oxford, and occasionally had lunch with him at the long table, well, the only table in the beefsteak.
He came and spoke for you at Oxford?
He did, yes.
What happened?
Oh, he was very funny. I mean, it was one of those very good occasions. He spoke to the Oxford, at a speaker meeting at the Oxford Union, and he was highly entertaining.
Something else that's happened over the weekend just nudges me to ask you, is Damien Green a friend of yours?
Oh, I've got the greatest admiration for Damien Green, who I like hugely. He's a really first-rate politician and a thoroughly decent, good man. So yes, I like Damien. But Damien and I have always disagreed on Europe from the very first time we met each other.
Is he a friend? I wanted to ask this because he wrote this weekend, even my friend, the intelligent and energetic Jacob Rees-Mogg, occasionally lapses in this way. What he meant was, the lapse he was describing was the assumption that we're in a strong hand in the Brexit negotiation.
I certainly think we're friends. I've always thought of Damien as a friend, and I always take it as a compliment if somebody says that one is a friend of theirs.
He didn't name any extreme Remainers in the article. It said in the piece he's not very keen on, I'm paraphrasing of course, but on extreme Remainers who want to stay in the EU. He's not very keen on extreme leavers when they lapse into error, as you apparently do. Didn't name any extreme Remainers, did he?
Well, Damien has always been a passionate pro-European, and there's no reason to suppose that his view has changed. That's been a really important part of his political makeup. And I think the first time we met was before the 1997 general election, doing a debate on Europe on television chaired by Andrew Neil, where he was putting the pro-European case for the Tory party and I was putting the Eurosceptic case. And nothing has changed. Damien is putting the pro-European case, which he puts extremely well and articulately, and I keep on putting the Eurosceptic case.
Talking of something that has changed, what was your reaction to the constitutional referendum in Ireland on abortion when you saw the result?
I thought it was very sad.
But of course entirely licit, because it's a decision for
Irish voters. But it is very sad, and it is sad that the unborn child's rights are now going to be lesser in Ireland. And I was very struck by something Jim Shannon said in relation to Northern Ireland. She said on the Today programme, he said that there are 100,000 people alive in Northern Ireland who would not be alive if Northern Ireland had the same laws as the rest of the United Kingdom. And I think that statement really ought to make one think.
You're not a supporter of imposing a new abortion settlement on Northern Ireland from Westminster, say, in the absence of the institutions having a vote in Parliament, the result of which would be bringing Northern Ireland's laws into line with those in the rest of the UK?
The issue there is not actually my views on abortion, but the constitutional and devolution settlement. And I've seen reports that the SNP are opposed to this for very good constitutional reasons, that once you set the precedent that Westminster can override the devolution settlement and determine what happens in one of the constituent parts of the Union in a devolved area, then surely it can do it in other areas too. And then how solid are the settlements that have been made with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Now, I appreciate there is a complication in Northern Ireland because the Assembly isn't sitting. But Northern Ireland has had its own law since long before this current devolution settlement was set up. And governments, parliaments need to be very careful and very thoughtful when, for a moment of political convenience, they override well-established constitutional principles.
What do you think will happen in the Commons about all this week?
I don't know, but I think the position of the Scottish Nationalists is highly significant, because I think that changes the argument. And frankly, the argument coming from the SNP is much stronger than it coming from me. Because everybody knows that when I make this constitutional argument, what my view is on abortion. Mm-hmm. And they may think, well, he's bound to say that because it fits his overall view of the world. And so however much, in my own mind, I've separated them, I quite understand why people would be sceptical of that. From the SNP's point of view, it is a much clearer constitutional argument because the SNP is not ideologically opposed to abortion.
The Commons presumably can't do anything very decisive this week, can it, in the sense that changing the position in Northern Ireland would require legislative change, whatever you think of the arguments back and forth, and you can't simply do that within a week with no bill.
But there is, I believe, a bill that may have this issue within its scope, which may be coming before Parliament, before the House of Commons in due course. But as far as I'm aware, it's not coming before the Commons this week. No.
Fine. Let's move on to another subject that definitely will come up in the Commons this week, and that is the subject of Heathrow. Chris Grayling is due to make a statement. Do you have a view?
Yes, I have a strong view on Heathrow and on airport expansion generally. I think it is overwhelmingly in the national interest to expand our airport capacity, and it makes sense to do it at the airport that people actually like to use, that is popular, has good infrastructure around it, is convenient to get to from the centre of London. And that means pushing ahead with Heathrow as quickly as possible. In my view, it's already taken far too long, and that we should have the airport capacity that is necessary. So if we need one more runway or two more runways, we should go ahead and have them. And dare I say, if we need to expand Gatwick, we should expand Gatwick too and have healthy competition. But I think the government needs to ensure that it looks at all the schemes. The difficulty with schemes where the government sets the return but the private sector provides the capital is that this becomes effectively a gilt-edged return, and you see a strong incentive to invest as much as you possibly can because your return is broadly guaranteed. And you saw this with the water companies early on, that they got a profit based on the investment they'd made. You saw it when I was living out in Hong Kong with the Hong Kong electric companies. And Heathrow therefore has an interest in expensive schemes because that's its best long-term return. And there is a scheme backed by a former Concorde pilot, which is lower cost and faster and ought to have lower landing charges. And without wishing to push myself forward as an expert on which scheme works, I think it's very important that this scheme is included in the assessment of how things are done, not just by Heathrow, who have a strong interest in maximising the level of investment, but by somebody who can do it on behalf of the nation, so the CAA, who I think will have to look at all the schemes.
Isn't this a horse that's already bolted, and which, getting back to the stable, would mean taking up even more time and causing more delay to getting a conclusion by doing it? I ask that because Howard Davis Commission was asked to look at all this, and it came up with a unanimous recommendation. The unanimous recommendation it came up with was the other scheme, not the pilot scheme, but for the new runway. So you could look at this scheme again, of course, but you would surely introduce a further element of delay.
I don't think there should be any further delay, because I think that there's another examination about to be done anyway, unfortunately. I agree with you. I mean, I think cracking on is something that really needs to happen, and we should have cracked on by now already. But I think if, as I understand it, there is a further and final report to be done, you need to include more than just the one scheme.
Talking of capacity and constraint and building and all that, last time we met, when we had a long conversation about Brexit, we tagged on a very brief discussion about housing at the end, and I promised we'd return to it. So let's just stand back for a moment and look at housing with a relatively new Secretary of State and an established government position. Let's just go back to first principles for a moment. The whole housing and planning framework in the UK essentially was set after the war by the Labour government, and everything that happens still happens essentially within that framework. It's one that some Conservatives are very keen on. So, for example, Roger Scruton, I think, hope I'm being fair to Roger, has written that the 1948 Act, I think it was, is one of the great pieces of post-war legislation because it helped to prevent the countryside being swallowed up entirely by development. Do you share that view?
No, I think it's a straightforward socialist act that believes that the man in Whitehall can plan and provide. And we know that that's not true, and that what they have consistently tried to provide is what people have not asked for. So surveys going back to the 1940s show that 80% of people want houses with gardens. And this has been something where the houses have shrunk, the square footage has become smaller and smaller, and the gardens have vanished. Densities have become higher, and there was also, it's less popular now, the scandal of tower blocks, which 3% of people said they wanted in these surveys. So what it's done is provide what the bureaucracy thinks is good for people, not what people actually want. And I believe that government is about providing people with what they want and allowing them to lead the lives they want to lead, rather than telling them how they ought to lead their lives. I also think a garden is just as much a green space as a municipal park or a field, and that we have become very narrow in our understanding of green spaces. It has to be a unified green space with no house anywhere near it, and then that's green. But if it's somebody's garden, that's a developed space. I just don't think that's true. And if you look at some of the development done in the 30s, you see that people got really quite nice houses, sized houses and gardens, which are now very popular, valuable properties. There's also an absurd argument on the value of land and how you should claw this back from the landowner. The only reason the land is so valuable is because the government has constrained the supply of it by bureaucratic fiat. And the latest proposal that you should maximise the price that can be paid by developers for land is balmy, because nobody will sell at a government set price. And what you need is more of a free market approach and less of a government command and control approach. And if you provide greater supply of land, what will happen? Lo and behold, the price will decline. And then you'll be able to build more affordable housing, but it'll be affordable housing that people actually like. And what is so interesting is that the politicians, I think, are behind the voters. When I speak to Conservative associations, even ones in the home counties, 5 years ago, if you said we needed much more building, that was the most unpopular thing you could say. Now when you say it, people shrug their shoulders and say, yes, that's obvious, why aren't we doing it? There's been a real change, and I think the politicians are the stick in the muds, and the electorate understand they want their children and their grandchildren to have houses. People know that the age of buying your first house has gone up and up, and this is just not good for society. People want to own their own home. It's a natural ambition, and the Conservative government should help provide for that. And to do that, we need to build more, and we need to lower the price of land, which you do by making more permissions available.
You would tear up the 48 Act and framework and go back to the 30s?
Well, I think you would look at some type of zoning arrangement so that you could work out where development could be and where it couldn't be. There will be still some areas you want to protect. There will be areas of outstanding natural beauty. There will be some green belt that's genuinely green belt. But there will be some green belt that is really poor quality scrub land that could easily be developed. A Labour MP has done a report saying that she could identify enough land in London of land around railway stations, things like that, not beautiful rolling hills.
That's not greenbelt, presumably.
I think some of it is greenbelt. I think that was her point, actually. And she could find 1 million houses by doing this. Now, I haven't seen the details of her report, but I think it's really interesting that people are beginning to look at this.
What you do is you draw a protective ring round AONB land, by the sound of it, and some green belt. Do you know how much?
No, I don't. I think you want to look at what the green belt is actually doing, what the land is like. You want to do individual site surveys. And I wouldn't say no building at all in AONBs, that you want to have some building there. You want to take a village in the AONB and say, well, this village can take 5 more houses, 10 more houses without ruining the AONB.
But anyway, it sounds like quite a lot of green belt could be built on. But if it couldn't, there really wouldn't be much sense you going for this kind of approach in the first place. You're really looking to build quite a lot of houses.
We've got to build a lot of houses. Our population has grown. We've had, 3 million more people come into this country in the last decade and a half, 20 years. And these people need places to live. And we haven't kept up with the building rate that we needed going back some decades. There is a big backlog of houses that we need to build, but we should make sure we build things that are what people want and are attractive. And I think you get them to be attractive by allowing the free market to work and giving people choice. Why don't you get attractiveness now? Because you have to build what the planners want, and therefore you get essentially mediocrity, because the planners will approve that, and you don't try and do anything particularly exciting.
Do you have any sense at all that the government's going to take up your ideas?
No, none at all. No.
But therefore, they're not going to hit their target, are they?
But this is what backbench MPs ought to do. Backbench MPs ought to try and promote debate. And I imagine some of what I've said will be very unpopular, and that there will be some people saying, no, we must protect the green belt. But actually, you've got to try and get political debate going, and therefore you need to put these ideas forward, and then perhaps you can get some movement and some thoughtfulness about how things can be improved.
Now, I understand that completely. I'm just trying to drill down to the question of whether you think, without such an approach being introduced, the government stands a cat in hell's chance of hitting its target of building 300,000 houses a year.
I think it's going to be quite difficult, and I think we're going to see bureaucratic proposals more than we're going to see free market proposals. And that concerns me, because I think free market proposals are more likely to work well. But let's see, there's a new Secretary of State, very able man, great opportunity for him to change the weather on this. And that's rather exciting. It
does seem to me there are two approaches to this. One is what I call the Rees-Mogg approach, which is liberalise the planning laws. The other is broadly the Nick Bowles approach, which does involve some liberalisation, but basically works within the present framework. So you have to have lots and lots of big-scale compulsory purchase orders to get hold of the land you need to hit the target.
Well, I'm against compulsory purchase because I think it undermines our basic freedoms and rights of property. I think compulsory purchase needs to be there in extremis, and that, yes, of course, the government needs to build a motorway. There are going to be occasions. But the government shouldn't use compulsory purchase for its own convenience. It should use it when it's really essential for a much bigger good. And there is another route that doesn't require compulsory purchase. Also, there are some people who own land who don't care that it's worth many millions if they develop it, because they want to preserve that land as green fields, and I think they should be entitled to do that.
What do you see as the role of social housing?
I think that social housing is an important part of the mix within a dynamic housing market. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that this is not a question of setting targets for how much should be built as social housing, but that when you build new houses, people move into them, freeing up the houses that they have moved from, and that those can become part of the social housing mix. I don't think saying 30% or 50% or 10% should be social housing recognises the dynamism of the housing market and the fact that the houses people are moving from become freed up.
Because under the present framework, critics of the government scheme point out that Macmillan was only able to hit his target because a great big chunk of it was council housing.
Well, and there may be something that you should think of doing with that. I believe Transport for London is one of the biggest landowners in London, and not all of the land that it's owned is being used for transport. And that there may be a thought that you could build on TfL land and that you could sell the building and allow people to buy the land over time. And that may be back to council house sales, that you see, the value of the land in London is a disproportionate amount of the total value of the property. If you could get the occupier to get a mortgage to cover the cost of building the property, and they would either pay some rent for the land, or they would be able to buy the land over time, or you would give them a big discount in 30 years' time if they lived in the property for a long time. You might be able to do things that use the equity the government has in land to try and help people onto the housing ladder in particularly difficult areas. It wouldn't work in areas where land isn't so valuable, but it might work very well in London. But you want to make sure it's long term. You don't want to set up a scheme that makes a lot of money for essentially small-scale property speculators.
There is a whole big, wider question about land that is basically on the books of organisations that are owned by the state. In Oliver Letwin's book, his memoir, there is an entire page about the difficulties of getting the departments to relinquish the land. One of the reasons for this must be if they relinquish the land is presumably on their books, and therefore there's some value to the Treasury in it being on their books. And I therefore presume there's constantly a battle between the lobbies in government that want to build more housing and the Treasury that's worried about the value of the land on the books of its department.
Oh, that must be true, and that'll be true through departments and through councils. That the state owns vast swathes of land. Isn't it true that the MOD owns land equivalent to the size of Surrey?
Question about MOD land, yes.
And that it's sold a few acres since the war. It must be a bit more than that, but very, very small amounts. And you've got to look at that. You've got to see whether the state needs to own all this land and whether some of it isn't very suitable for development.
Well, Jacob, we've had your memories of Albury War. We've had your sorrow on the Irish abortion decision. We've had some very radical thoughts about Heathrow and housing. Next week, when we next meet, perhaps we'll be able to delight some of our listeners who are very much focused on the subject by returning to Brexit. But at any rate, we've been able to have a small break this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.